We would be nothing without our past. But as logical as that is in principle, in our modern times, certain people seem to be quite happy to deny that again and again. A few weeks ago, news broke that the books of Roald Dahl, the author of Matilda and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, are now to be edited, to remove all potentially offensive terms. These include not only fat and crazy, but, and yes, seriously, also Rudyard Kipling, to avoid any references to colonialism. And after Roald Dahl, Ian Fleming's James Bond novels have now also joined the list of books that require urgent amendments in order to be considered acceptable by society. The problems that can arise from intervening in stories that have been around for a long time, whether in books or films, will be highlighted in this video. I'm glad you guys tuned in. I find it pretty interesting that newspapers that frequently report on interventions in artistic works often raise the question of whether it constitutes a censorship or not. What else could it be? Censorship, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is the action of preventing part or the whole of a book, film, work of art, document, or other kind of communication from being seen or made available to the public because it is considered to be offensive or harmful, or because it contains information that someone wishes to keep secret, often for political reasons. In my opinion, this precisely applies to what is happening with the books mentioned above. Just because the intervention is not done by the state, does that mean it's not censorship? Because what exactly is being done? Not only are single words being replaced, but rather whole sentences and passages of text that the examiners deem offensive. And who are these examiners? Independent, neutral, university bodies, or... Oh, after all, Netflix has held the rights to Roald Dahl's books since 2021. Netflix, a company known for not prioritizing any political agendas at all, but only being concerned with telling good stories. If you look at the changes in Roald Dahl's works, for example, you realize that these changes hardly have anything to do with common sense, but more with political ideologies. Few of us would complain if individual offensive terms and words were replaced. But what is currently happening is so much more than that. If an evil woman becomes an evil person, and an English father becomes an English parent, and Crazy Prince becomes Prince, and Mother's Dressing Table becomes just Dressing Table, and the Jungle Book author Rudyard Kipling is replaced with John Steinbeck because Rudyard Kipling could be associated with colonialism, then at some point the question arises, how far should interventions in an original work go? And what is actually achieved with changes like that? People are increasingly deprived of the opportunity to truly deal with the past. A handful of people get to decide what works from the past we, as end consumers, are allowed to read and watch, and which ones we cannot. By interfering with the original material and changing it, we are deprived of the opportunity to form our own opinions and to question the facts critically. We are patronized because we are not believed to have independent thought. But if all characters from the past were made to speak and think the same way as people from the 21st century, then no one would bother taking the time to examine the original materials and pose meaningful questions anymore. The past can teach us so much, but censorship in the present takes this opportunity away from us. If we continue like this, it's only a matter of time before the censorship craze becomes more and more widespread. Even the James Bond novels are now to be heavily altered to remove all instances of racism and sexism. Exactly how that will be done is a good question. I mean, in You Only Live Twice, Bond disguises himself as a Japanese fisherman and somehow manages to live undetected. In Goldfinger, there's a character named Pussy Galore. Should such works from the past now be changed because they don't align with today's values? The first James Bond book, Casino Royale, was published in 1953, and the last novel, The Man with the Golden Gun, in 1965. Should it now be considered a noble goal to simply ignore the fact that over half a century ago, our society had different customs and standards? Yes, we as consumers are being patronized, but that is not the only problem. Any kind of art form is a form of contemporary history. Regardless of whether the views of the artists are in line with our values today or not, we as a society have received something. We should take it for what it is and learn from it. It is highly doubtful that all artists of the past were bad people, exclusively racists and sexists, whose words decades ago have to be twisted today. Censorship is a deep intrusion into the legacy of an artist who has spent months, if not years, on their work. As I said before, if it was just a matter of replacing a few words or printing a short statement from the publisher at the beginning of a book, explaining that the language is no longer contemporary, etc., okay. But as it stands now, the fundamental reinterpretation of what is said, shown, or written is becoming more and more prominent. We can also observe this in current film and TV franchises as well. While original cinematic works are currently not as affected by censorship as novels, a lot of prequels, sequels and spin-offs have been completely reinterpreted in recent times. The James Bond in current films no longer has anything to do with the original character as initially conceived by Ian Fleming. And I'm not talking about the fact that the character has now been deprived of his actual sexist side that was given to him back then because, as I mentioned before, society was simply different in past times than it is now. But it was never that side that defined the character of James Bond. You can be an independent, charming ladiesman and a tough guy while still behaving appropriately. However, in the last film, Bond was portrayed as an empty, sentimental shell of his former self, lacking all the traits that made him such an iconic character. Because in modern times it's important to show at every opportunity that men also have a vulnerable side. Alright, but letting sentimentality now define the character of Bond is pretty odd. From let's make him less sexist to let's make him sentimental and weary of life is quite a jump. The Bond franchise is just one of many that have been reinterpreted by modern films and series makers. We all know what Amazon did with The Lord of the Rings, and the same with Lucasfilm and Star Wars. And yay, it looks like Indiana Jones is next. By reinterpreting to this extent, you show a lack of respect for the person who had the original idea for the whole story, even if they may have lived in a different time and held different values. It is not a question of small changes, but of drastic reinterpretations. And all of this has something to do with megalomania, where some people in the present time see themselves as more elevated than the rest of us, and believe it's their task to educate the world with their opinions and political attitudes. And those who argue with, yes, but we still have the old movies or the original books, can ask themselves, for how much longer? Because where will the censorship stop? Who's to say that in 20 years from now, people won't find completely different things offensive than they do now? And what does that actually mean for artists who write books or make films? How artistically freed will they actually be if they have to fear censorship or complete reinterpretation of their works? We need stories as a society, but once they are told, they should no longer be altered. And when stories are continued, one should proceed with utter respect for the creators. Otherwise, one is not only upsetting fans, but also presuming to reinterpret history, and that doesn't really help anyone, except maybe the ego of a small handful of people. Thanks for tuning in. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe. Also, you could be interested in this video about why too much political correctness in movies drives society apart. See you next time.